The Civil Rights Movement is a key historical period that is defined by the struggle for African American progress. We all learn about the Civil Rights Movement and many key events that make up the Civil Rights Movement, but we often forget to place these events in a greater historical context. Today, we will spend some time diving into some of the key events that took place during the Civil Rights Movement. But it's important to keep in mind that there's a lot more to learn about each of the topics being presented here. This introduction is meant to spur the interest of the viewer in one or two of these occurrences, so that you can choose which particular event you wish to conduct further research about. Before diving into the Civil Rights Movement, we'll spend a moment discussing the Civil War. The Civil War took place in the 1860s and was fought between the North and the South over the existence of slavery and the preservation of the Union. The war ended in 1863, when Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, stating that all slaves would be made free. This was a huge step towards African American freedom and progress, since the United States had been ruled by a system of oppressive and violent enslavement of African Americans up to this point. However, African Americans would quickly learn that the end of slavery did not mean equality. Now let's fast forward almost 100 years to 1954, to the landmark Supreme Court case, Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Keep in mind that during the 100 years leading up to this point, though slavery had ended, African Americans had experienced extreme levels of discrimination, segregation, violence, and brutal treatment throughout the United States, but especially in the South. In Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, the Supreme Court decided that schools would be integrated, meaning that African American and white children would attend the same public schools. The decision famously stated that separation is inherently unequal, acknowledging the poor conditions in African American schools. While this was another huge step in gaining freedom and equality for African Americans, racist sentiments in the South persisted, and schools failed to integrate without the involvement of the federal government. In 1955, two key civil rights events took place. First, Emmett Till, an African American teenager who was visiting Mississippi from his home in Chicago, was kidnapped and brutally murdered by two white men. He supposedly had flirted with a white woman in the town store, and in retaliation for this, the woman's husband and friend kidnapped and murdered Till. When the two men were put on trial, they were acquitted, meaning they were not found guilty. The decision outraged civil rights leaders and the entire country, because the jury found that the two men not guilty was made up of exclusively white, Southern men, meaning that the decision was likely impacted by racist sentiments. The murder and subsequent trial spurred the civil rights movement into further action. A few months later, Rosa Parks, an African American seamstress living in Montgomery, Alabama, refused to give up her seat on the bus to a white passenger. She was ultimately arrested, and her action was the start of the Montgomery bus boycott, which was led by Dr. Martin Luther King. In the boycott, civil rights leaders and participants refused to ride the buses until the buses were desegregated, which happened about 1 year later. Now fast forward again to 1957, and let's return for a moment to the desegregation of schools that was supposed to occur following Brown v. Board in 1954. In the South, this desegregation did not occur in most schools. As such, in 1957, Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, was forced to integrate. There were 9 African American students who were selected to attend the school. On the first day when they arrived at the school, they were blocked from entering by the police force based on an order from the governor. President Eisenhower had to send special troops to protect the 9 students, who became known as the Little Rock Nine for the remainder of the school year. Now we enter 1963, which was a year full of civil rights developments. First, Martin Luther King Jr., one of the most famous civil rights leaders, who was known for his nonviolent approach to protest, was arrested and wrote his famous Letter from a Birmingham Jail, where he lamented the systems of racism and segregation in the South. A few months later, another civil rights leader, Medgar Evers, is shot and killed. These events helped lead to the March on Washington, a major civil rights protest that took place in August of 1963, where Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. About 1 month later, in September of 1963, 4 young African American girls were killed in a bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. The girls were attending Sunday school when the church was bombed by white supremacists who wanted to attack civil rights leaders. In the second half of the 1960s, there were many civil rights events that are important to note. In 1965, Malcolm X, a black nationalist, was shot to death. Also in 1965, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act. In 1966, the Black Panther Party, which was a militant and often violent group of civil rights organizers, was founded. In 1967, major race riots broke out in Newark, New Jersey, and Detroit, Michigan, and in 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was shot and killed. Although Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the most recognizable leaders of the civil rights movement, the movement continued after his death and even continues today. Since the 1960s, African Americans and white Americans everywhere have disagreed about how to ensure that African Americans and all people are afforded equal rights. Though outright discrimination no longer exists in most parts of the country, there are some areas where racism persists. Further, we see contemporary examples of how racist institutions have continued to exist throughout America. For example, our prisons are full of African American men who are victims of a racist and unjust drug war, and racial segregation and poverty persist in predominantly African American communities.